First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Hegner Family Foundation, as well as North Central SARE. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring you these discussions for free. So thank you so much to them. And then thank you so much to you for joining us, because this is why we're doing it. And I'd also like to thank Toby for being with us tonight. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience with German agroforestry system. So I'm really excited to learn because I know nothing about German agroforestry. Toby, maybe you'd like to give a better introduction to yourself and then launch into your presentation.
Sure, sounds good, Christy. Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining me. This is a topic that's very interesting to me. I had the good fortune to spend a couple of years in Germany, getting my master's in forest science from the University of Freiburg in the state of Baden-Württemberg. And before I get any further, I just wanted to also just thank the Savannah Institute for hosting this forum and for asking me to present on a very interesting topic to me. So I hope it's interesting to you all, and my main goal is to stimulate questions about how what I present can relate to your own systems and interests and experiences. So I hope to have a good conversation at the end of this. Oh, there it is. Okay, so yeah, as I said, I lived in Freiburg in the southwestern state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany. I attended a international master's program, taught in English, so I'm not a fluent German speaker, so I admit some ignorance and have missed some nuance in my exposure to agroforestry in Germany, but I also did have a decent amount of exposure to it while I was there, and hope to paint a pretty good overview of the situation. So just to give you kind of background to the context in Baden-Württemberg, it is a very environmentally progressive place. It's famous for its good climate and outdoor recreation, and it is also famous for anti-nuclear energy protests in the 1970s, which sparked the German renewable energy revolution that we are aware of today. So for political reasons, it's known as the green capital of the country, and it also is the capital of the Black Forest region. Environmentally, it is situated in the very southwest corner and surrounded by this type of introduced coniferous forest. What you're seeing on the right is Douglas fir that was imported from the Pacific Northwest. Being part of the Black Forest region, it's got a very historically important connection with forestry. And the other two most important agricultural crops have been wine in the Rhine Valley, because it borders the Alsace region of France on the southwest edge of the state, and throughout the mountains and valleys, dairy farming was the third biggest economy, driver of the economy in the region. So the next few slides just show some features of the development patterns and the environments in the region, just illustrating how close the settlements and farmland and forest is concentrated in the landscape. This is pretty typical of the German countryside, although this is a particularly mountainous region. But it's very standard across all of Central Europe, and in fact, for there to be dense pockets of settlement in villages and small cities surrounded immediately by farmland and then by forest. And this is spread across repeated across the landscape. So this development pattern has a outsized influence on resource management thinking in Germany, because it clearly shows the pressure under which the natural resources are on from all sides. So this extends to the focus of my program, which was based on the framework of ecosystem management, which is essentially looking at how the local scale activities affect and are integrated into larger landscape and environments. So this pertains to agroforestry in Germany, in that agroforestry is viewed as a suite of practices among many others aimed at reintroducing ecological complexity to the national landscape. So it is approached from a number of different directions, and it is often brought up in conversations of general natural resource management and forestry, agriculture, and regional planning. So that brings us to the start of the talk, really, which is going to give another brief overview of the development of agroforestry in the country currently. What systems are being tried and by what actors, and then finally my own takeaways from being there for 2 years, and hopefully a good conversation with lots of questions. So, and I'm sorry if I skip ahead too quickly, or if you'd like to spend more time with any particular slide. I just wanted to go through those first ones, giving a snapshot of the environment there. And I've a number of more nice to look at images of the countryside, so we should get plenty of good insight into what it looks like. So, moving on, agroforestry is not a novel concept in Germany, because it has a long history of intensive resource management for multiple uses over centuries. As this picture, I like this one because it gives a pretty good image of the dense settlement followed by mixed use perennial agriculture, or at least interspersed perennial agriculture followed by the forest, and that, as I mentioned, is pretty standard, especially where it's geographically constrained by the topography of the area. So where the population density and resource demand is high, there was a utilization of niches within the landscape for small enterprises, and that bred crop diversity, and this survives until today, where you can still see farmers bringing chestnuts to be roasted at street markets or holiday markets, for example, and this is an English walnut as part of a remnant of a mixed fruit and nut orchard. So the legacies of these systems are still visible all across the landscape. And in addition to the remnant features, past resource depletion led to strict legal boundaries between forestry and agriculture. So in this example, this particular extensive silvopasture is considered now a special cultural landscape, but it was in fact a result of overgrazing over generations or centuries, and now it's being reintroduced intentionally in certain areas to enhance the landscape structural diversity. So this segregation between forestry and agriculture, which came out of resource depletion, created stark divisions on the landscape between forested land and pasture or arable land. And this was only exacerbated by intensification and increased efficiency in both agriculture and forestry. So what was once a pretty fluid transition of land uses between immediately around settlements all the way into the forest turned into pretty rigidly controlled segregated system, including the replacement of native mixed forests with exotic fast-growing monocultures, usually of evergreen species, silver fir and Norway spruce, highest among them. So apologies for this very sciencey graph, but basically a movement garnered interest from the scientific community to move back in the direction of reintegration along the landscape gradient from forest to settlement, and this was brought along by with popular and international political pressure to integrate biodiversity into all systems of resource management, and it falls under the banner of rewilding to enhance structural and habitat diversity across the landscape. So currently there are some legal and financial mechanisms for this movement, and major challenges have arisen, including the development over the period of segregation between nature protection and production of strict legal frameworks for everything from animal welfare to water protection and plant protection. So people come up against those despite some growing momentum for financial, especially systems for reintroducing past or modern agroforestry systems. Secondly, the time lag between the loss of some of these legacy systems and the current day has resulted in a steep loss of knowledge of troubleshooting, just problem solving for specific issues that arise. And along with that, there are few documented management regimes or processes. Additionally, it's a very political situation when talking about reconfiguring landscape or ecosystem management naturally, and so dealing with many relevant parties in any particular location and for any particular purpose is politically complicated. And finally, Germany is in a situation where a lot of their past agricultural commodities are no longer competitive on the global market, and this, in one hand, helps is a motivating factor for getting financial and legal support and subsidies for both maintaining legacy agricultural systems and also creating new ones, or researching new potential markets and systems. So yeah, and just a brief note on the image. It's basically a proposed a symbolic model of how reintegration on different scales of managed landscapes, managed systems, both require segregative nature protective schemes, which are listed in blue, as well as very specific integrated schemes. So sorry if that's not super clear, but it's just an example. So moving on to the current efforts in agroforestry in Germany. I categorize them into four main types of systems. There's the mainstream, which I mentioned, is gaining a lot of support as viable, as potentially viable ways to protect and rewild the agricultural landscape in financially sustainable ways. Whereas the maintenance of agricultural landscape diversity through the kind of legacy systems, as well as specific localized systems, are on a much smaller scale and reaching all the way down to the local food business entrepreneurs and community gardens, which are particularly interesting in Germany. So, referring to probably the system that's garnered the most interest financially is the silvo-arable commodity crop production. And among that, where Germany has led the way in many avenues for increasing their share of energy by renewable sources, bioenergy through short rotation kapas is steadily increasing in its market share, and right now, as in this image, it's being applied in a mine reclamation system. So where this was surface mined for lignite coal, they're now experimenting with the results of planting, I think in 2010, black locust in strips with wheat, I think it is. And this has a number of benefits, that it serves as a microclimate protectant, if that's a word, in the landscape. protecting from wind erosion and improving the temperature and moisture environment in the field. And I would recommend everyone, and we can pass this along at the end. It's a good resource. It's all in English. Just kind of the lead research network of forest energy, or rather short rotation coppice energy, will be available. Moving on to kind of the widespread heritage landscapes, especially the Streualpswiese, which is which means fruit orchard pasture, essentially. These extensive high-stemmed orchards that were typically grazed by sheep, and they actually arose with the advent of a commodity fruit market over 200 years ago, and they have been steadily decreasing with the intensification of apple production all around the world, and in Germany and Central Europe as well. And they are not particularly economical to manage, and so they've had to be protected for their ecological and cultural values. And unfortunately, there are not many left, but there are some really good and relatively intact systems, as well as many remnants that you can see pretty commonly. Just another example of that, sheep grazing an orchard. And finally, in the mainstream push for rewilding, it's necessary to talk about traditional forestry in Germany, because it has traditionally overlapped so much with other general natural resource management and agriculture, and it's relevant to agroforestry because it's in this rewilding endeavor, it's shifting from being seen as purely as a crop to being managed for multiple uses, as well as biodiversity protection, including, as this graph shows, there's a trade-off between management intensity and biological diversity. They've found in the literature, and systems, these are all pretty complex systems on their own right, but close to nature forestry, a set of principles around that, and mixed species plantations and forest pastures and coppice-based systems are all being considered more and more as part of the overall matrix of management, where they are applicable. They can add really valuable, the diversity of systems can add really valuable structural and habitat diversity to the landscape. So as this model shows, that this idea of a shifting mosaic of different, of retaining different features in a forest patch, for example, such as embracing disturbance and different purely protective elements, as well as some, types of harvesting methods. And again, this ties in closely with agroforestry, where especially traditionally the forests were used for a lot of grazing, as well as non-wood forest products. And so this is somewhat aspirational still, but especially in Baden-Württemberg, there's really taking hold this concept of the complex adaptive management of many varieties, adding value to the whole. So moving on, some of the other types of legacy, agricultural legacy, structures that add diversity to the landscape include these hedgerows, which traditionally lined the edges of parcels and secured from animals escaping. They're mostly found in disrepair, so they don't function as those multifunctional hedgerows. But there's research and endeavors to try new admixtures of species to enhance their value and actually entice landowners and farmers to to maintain them and improve them. But for the most part, they are just kind of remnant. And just to reiterate that it's widespread across the agricultural land that you'll find these legacies of former mixed-use parcels where especially you'll see rows or small patches of fruit or nut trees that have gone the wayside of getting split between heirs of family land. So, as I mentioned, forest grazing was traditionally a very important system, and including there are place names throughout the country that denote a specific practice. And so this is gaining popularity, and it's being slowed by the complexity that it adds to management. And some of the barriers include a need for close watch and knowledge of the animal's response to new variabilities in forage, and and the environment. For example, well, it's not in this picture, but there's a project reintroducing cows to 60 hectares of floodplain forest, and they found two pretty immediate problems where ticks were causing a lot of issues for especially the pregnant cows. And there was a lot of juvenile mortality, which they attributed to partially not being able to control for toxic plant forage, especially cattails. So despite the history of this being pretty widespread in particular areas, there's also a lot of issues with getting buy-in from foresters, for example, because since it was outlawed in the 19th century, animals in the forest is basically a German forester's nightmare, because there are strict rules about controlling herbivory in general, and including quotas for wildlife, for hunting deer especially, to eliminate loss of natural regeneration, essentially, or to enhance regeneration. So these are only so far being implemented in small targeted systems. So moving on to publicly funded university research, and the institute that I worked in most of the time I was there is doing a variety of trials and demonstrations on introducing high-value timber species into a variety of systems. I mentioned the multifunctional hedgerows, and alley cropping systems with shrub crops as well as annuals, and alongside short rotation coppice, like in the picture to the right with poplar. And they are focused on basically the silvculture of high value timber for less common high value species than what's typically available, trying to exploit niche markets. Oops. So again, just an image of the timber, and this is hazelnut in this example, an alley cropping system, and then kind of a more widespread outplanting on private land with a mixture of high value species into pasture. So in the Institute of Silviculture, they're approaching the complex adaptive management strategies from a variety of ways, focusing on understanding the interactions between species and mixed species stands, and looking at what intra and interspecific effects there are in plantations where two species are grown together up to 12, and that's part of it's a global network on understanding forest biodiversity, and that's another interesting project to read more about. There are some sites in Canada as well as one in Minnesota, and also just in the sustainable forestry world is looking at more of multiple use, multi-species, uneven aged forest management strategies. So just wanted to include this picture again to illustrate really the legacy of the segregative forest management across the landscape, where you have monocultures essentially of softwoods and hardwoods, and small parcelization as family land is divided. So this is just to illustrate the starting point from which this rewilding effort is working with in the forest management community. And just an image of the ident research plot showing one of the experimental plots of multi-species plantation and interaction. Don't think we have time to go into the whole experimental design. It's very complex, but basically that's one of the big pushes in this rewilding effort, is understanding how to move away from monoculture in the forest and revert back to native, diverse species stands. So another area in which bioregional agroforestry is taking hold. You know, some small examples of community forest or municipal land. There is need for diversification of income, and so following a storm, for example, in the Friesenheim community forest, there was a huge timber loss following a tropical storm in '99, and in order to try to recoup their losses, they opened the forest to a number of non-timber forest product enterprises, including Christmas trees and different berry products. And in the town of Donsdorf, they have been adding timber species to their remnant Streuobswiese and taking advantage of a payment for ecological services system where municipal development or companies have to pay into an account to compensate for their environmental footprint, essentially. Also, you have small companies like this one in Freiburg, which is foraging fir needles, especially fir buds, for a unique product that is pretty popular and tasty. So yeah, you have cases like that across the country, as well as small scale farming for the local market, diversified agriculture. One thing that's pretty special about urban agriculture in Germany is the long history of very small family parcels being allotted outside of cities. Like, this is pretty common in other countries in Europe as well, but it seems to have really thrived, at least especially in the Southwest, where you find an incredible amount of diversity of fruit trees and shrubs and annuals, and that create a pretty large footprint of crop diversity on the outskirts of cities for the most part. And these were a response to urbanization and getting people access to nature in the 19th century. Just another shot just to give you the scale and also show the amount of diversity there is. And then there are cases where you have your personal sheep and fruit orchard. I don't know what to make of that as far as its potential, but to conclude, I'd say my main takeaway is that we need to embrace looking at agroforestry as a means to an end for multiple goals within conservation and production-oriented initiatives. So, following, if we could learn anything from the trajectory that agroforestry in Germany is taking, it would be that we can make a stronger argument for the conservation value and the diversity of approaches that could be followed to reach that common goal. Open it up to questions if there are any. Thanks for sticking with me, everyone.
Thanks, Toby. This was really great, and I love all the pictures of everything that you have. Toby, I had a question to kind of get things started. Where they're doing silvopasture on, it sounds like, previous forest land. Are they doing it on the worst land? Like, it sounded like some of it was in floodplains, or maybe the land maybe wasn't so good.
They're mostly doing it where it had traditionally been done in the past. So there are these forests that show pretty clear evidence of being grazed by livestock, and that there are large remnant oaks, for example, and not a lot of understory development or mid-story development. So they're intentionally doing it in small tracts of forest stands of that type, and then there are also so that includes the floodplain forest, and that's an area in which I don't know well enough the full extent to which they're reintroducing silvopasture, for example.
Oh, okay. Well, so another question I had, I noticed some in one of the next slides, I think that you had, there were some pictures of some kind of tree protection. It looked like they were kind of triangular wood cages, maybe.
Can you see the presentation? Is it the right slide?
There it is. So it looks like wood structures around some of the new trees that are planted, and I was wondering, are those for deer protection, or are those kind of like the way we use tree tubes?
I actually think these are more for just establishment and stabilization from the wind.
Okay.
Yeah, they might also be baffles for deer. You know, just they irritate the deer enough that they won't damage them too much. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Going kind of back to the beginning, it sounded like the heath juniper pastures that were made, and it sounds like they're culturally desirable. Are they going back to that, or kind of promoting that culturally, or is it good for the landscape in some way? Because it sounded like it was a product of overgrazing, and so is that a healthy ecosystem? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it good for the soils? Is there another reason besides just diversity and cultural?
That's a very good question. I think it is primarily the value for increased landscape diversity. So it's just maintaining what is seen as a particular ecosystem where it hosts its particular organisms, and creates a different environment than the surrounding area of that nature, which has been reverted back to forest or is all pasture or farmland.
And then I guess I have another question as just kind of a novice agroforestry person myself. I have more of a soils background. And so what is short rotation kapa? What is kappasing?
Yeah, it refers to the practice of cutting a tree back to a low point on the stem, usually just all the way to the ground. And many species resprout, but some especially quickly and vigorously, and can actually regain their height and volume in a very short amount of time, faster than it originally took them to grow that amount. So it's a way of getting specific wood products, small dimension wood products, out of a repeated cutting of the tree. And it's been done in a lot of different ways around the world for a long time, and it's not always, all the way, all the stems cut all at once. But in this case, it is, it's pretty stark. It's a clear cut. It's an agricultural, agroforestry clear cut where they have a harvester that has an adapted harvester head that just shears the planting like a row of corn, essentially, and yeah, basically mulches it and shoots it into a container.
Oh, okay. But the idea is kind of like with grafting that your root system is already established, so it can kind of take off and
exactly.
grow a lot faster. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Toby, I'm curious about the term you use, rewilding, and if you think that has an impact on how landowners or farmers sort of are interacting with this whole, with agroforestry in general, and if you hear the idea of rewilding the landscape in America, or the sort of differences, like maybe philosophically, how people approach this, imagining it as rewilding the landscape versus maybe the economic business or whatever.
Yeah, that really cuts to the core of the differences between the context, because Germany, where there is such long-standing resource demand and pressure and population density, and the resulting simplification of systems and the reduction of landscape features and the corresponding biodiversity, that really is the philosophical difference, and that's the framework which I think a lot of agroforestry is seen as essentially as a conservation method, at least in many applications. And yeah, it's not by and large taken that seriously as an economic potential driver, and in this country we really don't have the same attitude about natural resource scarcity or nature in general. It's a pretty fundamental difference, different attitude about scarcity.
Right. Are you seeing a different buy-in from, that maybe it's not as difficult to get folks to buy into these practices, or it's just inherently something you do naturally?
Yeah, I think there are more parties who are open to it, because it's already so kind of prevalent in their mindset, where country lanes are lined by apple trees, and it's not it's something Germans understand when you talk about perennial diversity on the landscape and agricultural diversity on the landscape. That's something that's pretty well rooted. But trying to think, really where we might meet in the middle is in promoting small enterprise kind of crop diversification in small ways, such as in just enhancing the proportion of high value timber species in a woodlot, for instance, or in a particular agroforestry system. And yeah, I think that's equally the message that's being put out to farmers, especially, and landowners, as it is here, I think.
Well, the other question that I had, Toby, was about old growth forest versus what's being grown currently. And maybe this is kind of coming a little bit off of Kelly's question. Was the old growth forest, what species comprised the old growth forest, and were they like useful for humans in kind of the same way that like maybe the hickory and the oak hickory kind of ecosystem here in the Midwest were actually, usable to the Native Americans. And there's other instances where maybe baobab trees in West Africa, they're concentrated around where ancient settlements were. So people influence the old growth forests, and I was wondering, is there a difference between what people are trying to grow now and what maybe was grown back then in the old growth?
Yes, very much so. So it's only really within the last century, maybe century and a half, where the idea of introducing fast-growing monocultures really took hold. So prior to that, there was much more of a mixed species forest, which old growth, as you call it, would have looked more where it was holding on even 150 years ago, which is not very much. Would have been mostly beech, because it's such a slow-growing, shade-tolerant species. But really prior to the Industrial Revolution, where prior to really rapid deforestation of all forest types, there was pretty widespread oak savanna-like conditions as a function of oaks really multi-use characteristics. Like it was useful for forage, for animal forage, especially pig grazing, forest grazing, and the myriad uses for building and crafts. But it was mostly oak and not beech, because oak would withstand the pressure of animal grazing and reducing regeneration. So animal grazing would basically cut out everything that was shade tolerant enough to grow up underneath the oak, and the result would be pretty clear park-like conditions underneath old growth oaks. And that was pretty self-maintained by further grazing.
Oh, okay. And that kind of reminded me of another question that I had about the black locust. Is that also for forage? Do any of the pods like grazed, or is that any part of the forage, or is it just for like fast-growing wood to chip? And
in the commodity, the silva arable commodity systems, it's all for chipping. And I don't really know of any examples of people intentionally growing forage besides just kind of what's out in the various woodland pastures that are being reintroduced.
Oh, okay. So they just let the pods kind of decompose in place? And
yeah, as far as I know, they're, you know, in the kapa system, if they do reach reproductive age, which I'm not sure about black locust, but I assume they flower and fruit really early in their life cycle. But you know, whatever is there is useful for biomass. So I'm sure that's all taken as much as possible. And then I don't know what else. I don't think they do anything intentional with the seeds.
okay, so all the biomass. So do they artificially fertilize or chemically fertilize these systems?
I think in the experimental sites they do and they do not, and I don't know. I would imagine so. I would imagine that they do on the larger industrial commodity systems. Although they're also you know, touted for their mine reclamation function, being nitrogen fixer, that they're pretty good for reclaimed sites. So they could be pretty self-sufficient in fertility as well. I'm not positive how that plays out.
Interesting. Well, it looks like, oh, we're already at 7 o'clock. I feel like I hogged all the questions tonight. So if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us, and thank you so much, Toby, for sharing your knowledge. This has been really cool, interesting, and I hope everybody has a great night tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. I enjoyed the opportunity.